I ruined everything for a fleeting thrill of stolen moments that should never have existed. I let weakness overwhelm me, allowing temptation to destroy my integrity. Now I sit here wallowing in guilt knowing I ruined. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated on our latest stories. Then I felt it. At first it was just a whisper of warmth beneath my cheek, a faint pressure I could almost ignore, but as the seconds passed, his body was reacting right there beneath me, growing harder, the heat from it radiating even through the thick denim of his jeans. It was past midnight when my phone vibrated on the nightstand, its glow slicing through the darkness of my bedroom. At first, I thought I had imagined it lost somewhere between sleep and wakefulness. But then it buzzed again, insistent and sharp. I squinted at the screen, frowning at the unfamiliar number. My first instinct was to ignore it. Wrong numbers and late-night calls rarely meant anything good, but something in my gut told me to answer. Hello, my voice came out rough, thick with sleep. There was a pause on the other end, then a familiar voice, low and hesitant. It's me, Tristan. I sat up immediately, my pulse kicking up a notch. My stepson never called me, not when his father was home, not when he was away, not ever. Tristan, I asked, the name foreign on my tongue in this context. What's wrong? A breath, slow and shaky. My car broke down. I didn't know who else to call. I pushed back the covers, already reaching for the jeans I had draped over the chair earlier that night. The house was silent, my husband away on business, leaving only the distant hum of the city filtering through the windows. I glanced outside, the streets empty, the night thick with mist. Where are you? He rattled off an address, a part of town that made my stomach twist into a knot. It wasn't a place he should be at this hour. I grabbed my keys, slipping into my sneakers. Stay inside the car, lock the doors, and don't talk to anyone. I'm on my way. The drive was eerily quiet, the roads nearly deserted. The rain had started to pick up, misting against my windshield as I followed the GPS deeper into unfamiliar streets. Streetlights flickered, casting long broken shadows, and rundown warehouses lined the narrow road where Tristan's car sat, hazard lights blinking weakly. I pulled up behind it, my fingers tightening around the steering wheel before I exhaled and stepped out. The cold night air bit through my hoodie as I walked to the driver's side. Through the fogged-up window I saw him, slumped forward slightly, elbows on his knees, his face obscured by damp hair. I tapped on the glass. He flinched before looking up, his expression shifting when he recognized me. The lock clicked and I pulled open the door. Tristan looked off. His usual sharp confidence was absent, replaced with something raw, something uncertain. Rain had darkened his blonde hair strands, clinging to his forehead, and his hands were rubbing together as if he couldn't quite shake off the cold. What happened? I asked, keeping my voice even. He exhaled, looking away for a second before answering. The engine died. No warning. My phone was almost dead. He hesitated, then met my eyes. I didn't know who else to call. The weight of those words settled between us, heavier than I expected. Not his father, not a friend. Me, I swallowed, nodding toward my car. Come on, I'll take you home. He hesitated, glancing back at his car before sighing and climbing out. When he stood, he was closer than I anticipated. The rain slicked air between us, humming with something unspoken. For a moment he just looked at me, his dark eyes scanning my face, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. If you're enjoying the story, consider subscribing to my channel and leaving a comment about what you like or dislike. Thank you for your support. Neither of us spoke as we slid into my car, the rain tapping against the roof, the city stretching out ahead of us in quiet, restless anticipation. The car's heater kicked in as we pulled away from the curb, feeling the silence with a soft hum the rain had picked up, streaking against the windshield, blurring the city lights into long smears of color. Tristan sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his head tilted toward the window, watching the empty streets roll by. For the first few minutes neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick, filled with everything unsaid. He rubbed his hands together absently, as if trying to bring warmth back into them. I turned the heat up a little, sneaking a glance at him. His jaw was tight, his shoulders tense beneath his damp hoodie. You okay? Finley asked, my voice softer than I intended. He didn't answer right away. His fingers flexed against his knee before he exhaled. Yeah, just tonight sucked. I nodded, waiting. I knew better than to push a few more moments past the rain tapping against the glass, the road stretching endlessly in front of us. Then he let out a quiet laugh, bitter, almost self-deprecating. You ever have one of those nights where everything just goes to at once? He turned his head slightly, just enough for me to catch the flicker of something dark in his expression. I glanced at him, my grip tightening on the wheel. Yeah, I admitted. Plenty of those. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. I don't know why I called you. That hit somewhere deep, but I kept my voice steady because you knew I'd come. He turned to look at me fully this time, and for the first time tonight his walls cracked just a little. His eyes were darker in the dim car, his gaze steady, searching. Yeah, he said after a beat. I did something in my chest tightened. I forced my attention back to the road, gripping the wheel a little harder than necessary. The city passed in a blur, the neon lights flickering against the wet pavement. His presence beside me was heavier than it should have been, like he was taking up more space than the passenger seat allowed. You don't have to tell me what happened, I said after a while, my voice careful. He exhaled, leaning his head back against the seat, staring at the ceiling. Some things are just better left alone. That wasn't the whole truth. I could hear it in the way his voice wavered slightly, in the way his fingers drummed against his thigh as if trying to shake something off, but I didn't press. Instead, I let the silence settle again, filling the space between us like a quiet storm. The rest of the drive passed in something that wasn't quite uncomfortable, but wasn't easy either. Every now and then I'd feel his gaze on me, like he was about to say something, but thought better of it. The air inside the car was warm now, almost too warm, making the dampness of our clothes cling to our skin. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I turned off the engine, but neither of us moved. The rain was heavier now, drumming against the roof, washing the outside world into a muted blur. Tristan sighed, running a hand through his damp hair, making it messier than before. Thanks for coming, he murmured, his voice quieter now. I nodded, glancing at him. You can always call, no matter what time it is. He looked at me, then really looked at me, and something in his expression made my stomach clench. There was something raw there, something vulnerable. His gaze dipped just for a second before he blinked and looked away. The air felt too thick, too charged. I cleared my throat, reaching for the door handle. You should get inside. Get some rest. He hesitated, like he wanted to say something else. Then with a slow nod he pushed the door open. The rush of cold air sent a shiver down my spine. He stepped out, then paused, turning back slightly. The rain blurred the edges of him, but his voice cut through the night, steady and low. I'm glad it was you. I stepped out of the car and followed Tristan up the wet pavement, the rain soaking through my hoodie. Within seconds, the porch light flickered weakly above us, casting long shadows as I reached into my pocket, fingers seeking the familiar shape of my house keys. They weren't there. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I checked again, other pocket, my bag, even the back pocket of my jeans. Nothing. Tristan, already at the door, glanced back at me. You good? I swallowed, my fingers tightening around my empty pocket. I think I lost my keys. He frowned, his damp hair clinging to his forehead as he turned fully toward me. You sure? Panic bubbled under my skin as I patted myself down again, retracing my steps. In my mind I had grabbed them, I was certain, but between leaving the house, rushing to help Tristan, and the drive back, they had somehow vanished. I stepped closer to the door, gripping the handle and giving it a desperate tug, but of course it was locked. My husband had made sure of that before leaving on his trip. I exhaled sharply, my breath coming out in a shudder. Tristan ran a hand through his wet hair, watching me. No spare, not with me, I muttered, my voice tight. The realization hit hard. I had nowhere to go. The only option was to wait until morning, when I could either find my keys in the daylight or call someone to let me Tristan let out a slow breath, glancing at the storm raging around us. Come on, he said, tilting his head toward the car. We'll wait it out in. Inside I hesitated, my pulse skittering. But what other choice did I have? Wordlessly I followed him back down the driveway. The cold air pressed against my damp clothes, and by the time we slid into the car my fingers were trembling. Tristan started the engine, letting the heater kick in. A thick silence filled the space, the windshield fogging slightly from our combined breath. I leaned back in my seat, exhaling slowly, trying to push down the frustration and tension knotted inside me. You okay? Tristan's voice was quiet. I let out a breathless laugh, shaking my head. Not really, he huffed softly. Yeah, me neither. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. I turned my head slightly, watching him in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. His profile was sharp, his jaw tense, his hands resting loosely on his lap. He looked different in this light, more tight, tired, more distant, more vulnerable. I shifted, tucking my knees up slightly, trying to get comfortable. Guess we're stuck here for a while. Could be worse, he murmured, his gaze flicking toward me. There was something unreadable in his expression, something that made the air between us feel heavier than it should have. I forced out a small smile. Yeah. How? A ghost of a smirk touched his lips. You could have lost your keys in a worse part of town. At least you're stuck here with me. I rolled my eyes but couldn't stop the warmth that crept up my spine at his words. Lucky me, I muttered, leaning my head back against the seat. The rain continued to fall outside, enclosing us in a cocoon of warmth and silence. The minutes stretched on, and I could feel the exhaustion pulling at me, my body sinking deeper into the seat. Then Tristan shifted beside me, ear shivering. He noted I hadn't even realized it, but now that he mentioned it, I could feel the damp cold still clinging to my skin, the chill stubborn, despite the heat blowing from the vents. Before I could protest, Tristan pulled off his hoodie, leaving him in just a thin t-shirt. He bunched up the fabric in his hands before offering it to me. Here, take this. I hesitated. You'll be cold. All live. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. Slowly I reached out my fingers, brushing his as I took the hoodie from him. The warmth of his skin lingered on the fabric, sending an unexpected shiver down my spine. I swallowed hard, gripping the material tighter before pulling it over my head. It was oversized on me, the sleeves hanging past my hands, the scent of him wrapping around me, something faintly musky, something distinctly him. I looked over at him, and for a split second his gaze dipped, just for a moment, before he turned away, exhaling softly. The storm outside had settled into a steady rhythm, the rain tapping softly against the roof, the occasional gust of wind rattling the car inside. The air had grown warmer, the heater working to chase away the lingering cold. Still, exhaustion weighed heavy on my body, the dampness of my clothes making it harder to get comfortable. I shifted in my seat, trying to find a position that didn't leave my limbs aching. Tristan sat beside me, one leg stretched out, the other bent slightly, his fingers idly tapping against his knee. His hoodie was still draped over me, oversized and warm, and every time I moved the scent of him curled around me, something deep, familiar, almost grounding. You should sleep, he murmured. I turned my head slightly, meeting his gaze in the dim glow of the dashboard. His voice was softer than usual, less guarded. The edge he always carried had dulled, replaced by something quieter. I sighed. Easier said than done. He let out a quiet breath, tilting his head back against the seat. Yeah, I know. A few more minutes passed in silence. The weight of the night was pressing down on both of us now, the exhaustion creeping in slowly, making my limbs feel heavier, my blinks slower. The warmth of the car, the low hum of the heater, the rain outside, it all blurred together into something lulling in, something almost safe. I shifted again, instinctively curling into the fabric of his hoodie. The movement pulled another sigh from me, frustration mixing with fatigue. You never stop fidgeting, do you? K's voice held a hint of amusement. I let out a small, tired laugh. Not when I'm uncomfortable. He was quiet for a moment, then shifted slightly, moving his arm against the console between us. Here, he said, his voice almost hesitant. Might be better if he didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. I hesitated for only a second before moving, turning toward him just enough to rest my head against his shoulder. The moment I settled against him, a slow warmth spread through me. His body was warm beneath the thin fabric of his t-shirt, his breathing steady, deep. At first I kept myself rigid, unsure if this was too much, if I should pull away, but then he exhaled, shifting slightly, his shoulder angling just enough to accommodate me, and something inside me unraveled. I closed my eyes. The exhaustion that had been clawing at me all night finally settled into something softer, something I didn't want to fight anymore. The rise and fall of his breath became something rhythmic, something steady. I could hear his heartbeat, faint but strong, beneath my ear. You comfortable now? His voice was quieter, closer. I nodded against him. Yeah. A pause, then softer. Good. The car was filled only with the sound of the rain, the occasional creak of the lee seats. When either of us shifted at some point, I felt Tristan's head tilt slightly, just enough that his cheek brushed against the top of my head. Not intentional, not accidental either. My breathing slowed. I didn't move away. Neither did he. Somewhere between the storm and the silence, between the weight of the night and the warmth of him, sleep finally found me. The warmth inside the car had settled into something deep, wrapping around us like a cocoon against the storm outside. The low hum of the heater filled the silence, blending with the rhythmic tap of rain against the windshield. Tristan hadn't moved since I'd rested my head against his shoulder, his presence solid and unmoving beside me. But at some point exhaustion pulled me down completely, and my body shifted, slipping lower without me realizing it. My cheek found a new resting place, not his shoulder but his lap. The moment I landed there, a slow awareness crept into my hazy mind. The fabric of his jeans was firm beneath me, his thigh warm even through the denim. My breath hitched slightly, though I kept my body still, pretending I hadn't noticed, pretending I was still lost in sleep. But I knew better, and so did he. Tristan had gone completely still. The quiet between us changed, thickening like the air before a storm. He wasn't breathing the same as before. It wasn't obvious, nothing dramatic, but I could feel the subtle shift, the deeper inhales, the way his body seemed locked in place, as if any movement might shatter whatever delicate balance we had found ourselves in. Then I felt it. At first it was just a whisper of warmth beneath my cheek, a faint pressure I could almost ignore, but as the seconds passed, it became something more, something unmistakable. His body was reacting right there beneath me, growing harder, the heat from it radiating even through the thick denim of his jeans. A slow pulse of heat coiled low in my stomach, my fingers curling slightly where they rested near my chest. I wasn't supposed to notice, he wasn't supposed to notice, but there was no ignoring it now. Neither of us moved, neither of us spoke. The silence had weight now, pressing against my skin, making the space between us feel smaller, the air warmer, heavier. I could feel the tension in his body, the way he held himself so still, like any shift might break whatever restraint was keeping us in check. My breathing shallowed, my pulse thrumming just beneath my skin. I knew I should move, should sit up, should pretend this never happened, but the warmth of him beneath me, the steady rise and fall of his breath, the lingering scent of him still clinging to his hoodie, all of it kept me frozen in place. I didn't know how long we stayed like that. Seconds stretched into minutes, the storm outside continuing its restless song. I could feel the weight of Tristan's gaze somewhere above me, though I refused to look, refused to acknowledge the line we were dangerously close to crossing. Eventually he let out a slow, shaky breath, his fingers twitching slightly against his thigh, then barely above a whisper, he murmured, "You should get some sleep." His voice was different now, lower, rougher, strained in a way I hadn't heard before. I swallowed, forcing my own breath to steady my mind racing even as I let my body stay relaxed. "Yeah," I whispered back, eyes still closed, but we both knew neither of us would be sleeping tonight. The car was too warm now, the air thick with something I didn't have the courage to name. My body remained still, my head resting against Tristan's lap, but my mind was racing, hyper-aware of every shift in the space between us. His body was tense. Beneath me, his breaths measured in, careful, as if he was trying not to give too much away, but I could feel it all of it. The slow, steady heat that had built beneath me hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown, pressing against my cheek in a way that made my stomach tighten, my own breath catching in my throat. I knew I should move, should pull away, should end whatever this was before it became something neither of us could pretend to ignore. But I couldn't. The weight of exhaustion mixed with something deeper, something that had been lingering beneath the surface for longer than I was willing to admit. I shifted slightly, just a small movement, barely enough to be noticed, but I felt the way his thigh tensed beneath me, the way his fingers curled against his knee, gripping the fabric of his jeans as though grounding himself. A breath left him uneven, shaky. I swallowed hard, my own pulse hammering in my ears. The space inside the car felt too small, the world outside lost in the rain and darkness. It was just us locked inside this moment, inside something we both knew had gone too far, but neither of us had the strength to stop. Tristan let out a slow breath above me, one that almost sounded like a quiet curse under his breath. His body was still rigid, his muscles tight, his restraint palpable. For the first time I wondered what was going through his mind. Was he struggling the same way I was? Was he waiting for me to move, or was he afraid of what would happen if I did? Seconds stretched between us, thick with unspoken intention. I could feel the way his body was reacting, the way he was trying desperately to keep himself in check, and yet neither of us broke. The moment I knew I had to be the one to move, to create distance before this crossed into something we wouldn't be able to take back. With a slow, careful breath, I pushed myself up, my hands pressing lightly against his thigh for leverage. As soon as I moved, I felt his entire body tense beneath me, a sharp inhale escaping him before he clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists against his lap. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my face just inches from his, now close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his skin. His eyes flickered to mine, dark and unreadable in the dim light of the dashboard. For a moment neither of us moved, then his gaze dropped just briefly to my lips. My breath hitched, a decision hung between us, fragile and dangerous. But just as quickly as the moment came, it passed. I pulled away completely, shifting back into my seat, hugging my arms around myself as if that could shield me from whatever had just happened. Tristan exhaled a slow and deliberate breath, dragging a hand over his face. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I turned my gaze to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, my reflection blurred against it. The air inside the car had changed. It wasn't just warm anymore, it was charged, thick with something we had been pretending to ignore all night. The rain outside blurred the world beyond the windows, enclosing us in something private, something dangerous. I should have looked away, should have let the moment pass, but I didn't. Tristan was watching me, his gaze heavy, unreadable. His breathing had slowed, but there was something restrained in the way his chest rose and fell, something barely held together. My fingers curled against the fabric of his hoodie, my body still humming with the ghost of where I had been just moments before, with the heat of him still lingering on my skin. I didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him, maybe it was me, but suddenly the space between us vanished. His lips brushed mine, just barely, just enough to send a shiver down my spine, to make my breath catch in my throat. He hesitated there, hovering, waiting, his fingers twitching against his thigh as if he was fighting himself. He was giving me a chance to pull away. I didn't take it. My eyes fluttered shut, and that was all it took. The hesitation snapped. Tristan's mouth crashed against mine, the restraint he had been holding onto all night finally breaking. His hand came up, fingers threading into my hair, tilting my head as he deepened the kiss. Heat surged through me, melting any last trace of hesitation. His lips were warm, urgent, parting mine with a hunger that sent a sharp ache straight through my chest. I gasped against him, and that sound seemed to undo something in His other hand found my waist, gripping tight, pulling me closer. The car was small, too small, but it didn't matter. The space between us was gone, erased by the way he pressed against me, by the way his fingers dug into my side like he was trying to memorize the feel of me beneath his hands. The kiss turned desperate, his breath mixing with mine, his body burning against me even through our clothes. I shifted without thinking, moving closer, climbing over the console until I was straddling his lap, my knees pressing into the seat on either side of him. He let out a low sound, something deep and raw, his hands sliding down to my hips, gripping tight. His fingers flexed, his lips parting against mine, but just as his hands started to push beneath the hem of my hoodie, a sudden noise outside. We both froze, our breaths came fast and uneven, our bodies tangled together, heat still buzzing between us. Tristan's grip on my waist tightened instinctively, his chest rising against mine as we listened. The rain still poured, masking the sound, but there had been something, a noise, a movement. My pulse pounded in my ears. I turned my head slowly, looking toward the window, my skin still burning from where his hands had been. The street outside was empty, dark, nothing but the flickering glow of a street light cutting through the rain. But the moment was broken. Tristan's hands flexed once against my hips before he exhaled sharply, his forehead dropping against my shoulder. I could feel his pulse racing beneath my fingertips, matching mine beat for beat. I swallowed hard, my body still aching, still on edge. Whatever had just happened between us, it wasn't over, it had just begun.